Hello, fourth grade. Mrs. Pecora back with reading our next installment of Bunnicula, A Rabbit Tale of Mystery. Remember, if you hear snoring, it's not Mrs. Pecora. I did not fall asleep while reading you this book. I actually love this series of books, but it's my puppy, Winston, who is sitting next to me on the couch. And although he likes to read, he is sound asleep. So if you hear some snoring, it's coming from him. So we left off, and Chester instructed Harold to do his thing, but Harold wasn't quite sure what that meant. So let's read and see what's going on. Well, he wanted him to get him out of the cage. So let's read. What? 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 I verbalized. How am I supposed to do that? Use your head, he answered. And then he was gone. Looking at the cage, I realized that was precisely what I would have to do. Until this moment, I have never had to face the possibility of actual physical contact with a real live rabbit. I looked upon my chore reluctantly. I seem to recall my grandfather telling me that one picked a rabbit up by its neck with one's teeth. This I attempted. Oops. Hold on, boys and girls. Something popped up on my phone, and now it's blocking view. Hold on 1 minute here. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. This I attempted, though the very idea set my stomach churning. I squeezed my head through the tiny door and gently placed my teeth around the skin of the bunny's neck. To avoid any suggestion of violence, I've never been one for the sport of hunting. I preferred to think of myself as the creature's mother, carrying it off to safety. Unfortunately, I couldn't carry it anywhere, for once my head was in the cage, it wouldn't come back out again. I could go neither forward nor backward. At that moment, Chester appeared at the door, carrying in his mouth what looked every bit like a nice, big, juicy, raw steak. My eyes popped, my teeth dropped Bunnicula, my mouth opened, and I began to drool. After all, I had missed lunch. Chester, what are you doing with that steak? Haven't you gotten him out of there yet? I can't get either of us out of here. My head's stuck. Oh, Harold, sometimes I despair. Here, I'll get you both out. I should have done everything myself. He came over, dropped the steak just a few feet away from me, and climbed up on my shoulders. You pull your head out while I push against the cage. Who gets the steak? I asked. Don't worry about the steak, Harold. Just pull. I would have more motivation if I knew who is to get the steak. Chester ignored me. I pulled, he pushed. I felt something go pop. We all fell in a jumble. Chester, the cage, Bunnicula, and me. When I looked around, Bunnicula was lying next to me, still sound asleep. There you are, I said. We got him out. Now let's eat. No dice, said Chester. Just read this to me so I'll be sure I'm doing it right. Then he handed me a book. That book again. Start at the top of the page, Chester said as he picked up the steak. Why don't you read and I'll hold the steak? Chester replied. I took it to mean that I was to start reading. To destroy the vampire and end his reign of terror, it is necessary to pound a sharp steak. Chester interrupted. A sharp steak, he asked. What does that mean? I'll taste it and I'll tell you if it's sharp, I said. Never mind, this'll do with sirloin. Keep reading. To pound a sharp steak into the vampire's heart. This must be done during the daylight hours when the vampire has no powers. Okay, he said. This is it. I'm sorry I had to go this far, but if they'd listened, this wouldn't have been necessary. He dragged the steak across the floor and laid it across the inert bunny. Then with his paws, he began to hit the steak. Are you sure this is what they mean, Chester? Am I anywhere near his heart? He asked. It's hard to tell. All I can really see are his nose and ears. You know, he really is sort of cute. Chester was getting that glint in his eyes again. He was pounding away at the steak harder and harder. Be careful, I cried. You'll hurt him. Chester increased his attack. I was really getting worried when the door opened and Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were suddenly in the room with us. Chester! Mrs. Monroe screamed. What are you doing with my dinner? Robert, get that steak away from Chester. And what's the matter with Bunnicula? Why is he on the floor? Mr. Monroe took the beautiful steak away. I wished it a fond farewell with tears in my eyes. As the kitchen door swung open, Chester whispered with cold determination, "All right, the last resort," and dashed into the kitchen. Seconds later, he was back, carrying his water dish between his teeth. He ran toward Bunnicula and with a mad yowl, threw the dish of water at the rabbit. Unfortunately, he was so hysterical that his aim was not the best. With water dripping from my ears, I watched Mrs. Monroe pick Chester up by the scruff of his neck and toss him unceremoniously out the front door. "Robert, we are going to have to do something about that cat. Look at this mess. Dinner's ruined, the poor bunny's out of his cage, and Harold is sopping wet." I tried to look as pathetic as I knew how. "Oh, poor Harold," Mrs. Monroe cooed as she dried me off. "You've had a rough day, you and Bunnicula. I don't know what's the matter with your friend, but unless he learns how to behave, he'll have to spend the night outside." Mr. Monroe, meanwhile, had restored Bunnicula to his cage and the cage to the windowsill. I couldn't believe it when I saw that Bunnicula was still asleep. "Anne," Mr. Monroe said, "the steak is ruined. Why don't we let Harold have it? He deserves a treat anyway, don't you, old boy?" I panted appropriately. After my delicious dinner, I returned my attention to the book still lying open on the floor. Another method of destroying the vampire is to immerse the body in water. The body will then shrivel and disappear as the vampire emits one last scream of terror. Phew, I thought, so that's what he was trying to do. Thank goodness he missed. I had no regrets about missing a scene like that. Poor Bunnicula. I looked over toward the cage, and there on the other side of the window was a pathetic, tabby face looking in. His little nose was pressed against the window. I couldn't hear him, but from the movement of his lips, I could see he was very unhappy. Poor Chester. As for me, Mrs. Monroe spent the evening petting me, and the family chatted with me all night long. And of course, I had my yummy steak dinner, so it wasn't such a bad day after all, except now that my steak was all gone. Poor Harold. So boys and girls, I don't know if you get what Chester was trying to do, but he mixed up the words steak. He thought it meant the steak that you eat, S-T-E-A-K, but actually to kill a vampire, you'd put an S-T-A-K-E through their heart, that kind of steak. So that is my favorite part of the whole book. I think that part's super duper funny. And the first time I ever read it with my son, we laughed so hard and we had tears streaming down our face because I thought that part was super funny. So let's read on and see what else happens in our book, Chapter 7, A New Friend in Need. In the days that followed, Chester's behavior was exemplary. He purred and he cooed and he cleaned his paws and he rubbed up against everyone's legs to show what a good boy he was. I was getting worried. Chester acts that way only when he has something devious in the back of his mind, but I didn't know what it was. He had tried everything in the book to get rid of vampires, and all his efforts had failed. But I knew from the expression on his face that something was definitely up. Of course, I didn't know for certain because he had not spoken to me since the steak incident. I guess he realized that my heart wasn't in the destruction of the bunny vampire. In fact, I was beginning to like the little fellow. The Monroes were relieved by Chester's improved behavior. They didn't know how to account for his strange doings, but to their credit, they were willing to let bygones be bygones. The only disturbing factor in all our lives was the reappearance of the white vegetables each morning in the kitchen. And yet, after a few days, even that stopped and life seemed to return to normal. One evening, I dropped by Bunnicula's cage to chat. I found myself doing that more and more since Chester had stopped talking to me. Of course, Bunnicula didn't talk back, but he was a good listener. I'd begun to think of him as a friend, a strange one granted, but one can't always choose one's friends. I was distressed this particular evening to see that he was dragging his ears as it was. He looked tired and listless. I felt his nose, and it seemed a little warmer than it should have been. I became alarmed. I ran over to Toby, who was doing a picture puzzle on the floor, and began to bark. Something I only do in case of extreme emergency, since even I do not care for the sound. "What's the matter, Harold?" Toby asked without moving. "Are there burglars?" I ran to the cage and looked at Bunnicula. I looked back at Toby and whimpered. Toby just looked confused. "Do you want to play ball with Bunnicula? Shall I take him out of the cage?" "Woof!" I responded, indicating, I hope, that that was indeed what he should do. "I'll ask Mom and Dad, Harold. You wait here." He was back in a minute, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Harold, but Mom says you can't play with the rabbit. It causes too much commotion." I looked down at the floor and whimpered again. Sorry, Harold. Maybe later when we're all here together. I regarded Bunnicula, whose eyes met mine. He gave a little shudder, and I felt like crying. My friend was sick, and I didn't know what to do. I wish I could tell Chester, but I knew that it was no use. He was just too mad at me. I would have to sort this one out on my own. All right, boys and girls, we're going to stop here. I think we're getting close to being finished with the book, so stay tuned. Bye-bye.